They dropped her into the death pit, and when the apex monster approached, Dr. Alara Winters stood frozen in terror. The massive leviathan lowered its enormous head, its 5 compound eyes, studying her intently. Instead of devouring her, as legends claimed, the creature gently extended a tendril, wrapped it around her hand, and then, defying all expectations, delicately pressed its feathery appendages against her palm in a kiss of acceptance. The crystalline hull of the Galactic Union sparkled under the artificial light, refracting in 1,000 directions that made the weary representatives shield their eyes. 17 species had gathered for this assembly, and the tension in the air was palpable. Territorial disputes, resource allocations, and ancient grudges simmered beneath a veneer of diplomatic courtesy. In the center of it all stood Dr. Alara Winters, her shoulders squared despite the gravity of her situation. At 29, she had already saved a dozen planets from ecological collapse. Her reputation as a brilliant human ecologist preceded her. But today, that meant nothing. The blue-tinted lighting cast shadows across her determined face, highlighting the defiance in her eyes. "Dr. Winters," High Arbiter Voss's voice boomed across the chamber. The 8-foot-tall Crestian's crest flared with the authoritative orange of judgment. "You stand accused of tampering with the Kavix ecosystem by introducing foreign botanical species to a protected moon." Alara's hands tightened into fists at her sides. "I was conducting controlled research to prevent a cascade failure in the native fungi. The fruit seedlings would have—" "Silence!" Voss slammed a scaled appendage onto the podium. "The Council has reviewed your so-called research and found it to be reckless experimentation at best, ecological terrorism at worst." The assembled representatives murmured, their diverse anatomies shifting in various displays of agreement or discomfort. Alara scanned their faces, searching for allies, but found only political calculations behind alien eyes. "The moon of Kavix 4 is a designated preservation zone," continued Voss. "Your actions, regardless of intent, violated 17 statutes of the Ecological Protection Act. And my actions would have saved the mycological network that your preservation statutes are failing to protect." Alara took a step forward, earning a warning hiss from the security drones hovering at her periphery. "The native fungi are dying because the Council refuses to acknowledge the impact of nearby mining operations. My fruit seedlings would have stabilized the soil chemistry." A Xanthian diplomat with translucent skin that revealed her pulsing organs leaned forward. "Is this true, Arbiter? Are the fungi suffering due to industrial activity?" Voss's crest darkened. "The mining operations are beyond the protected zone and fully compliant with Union regulations." "On paper," Alara interjected. "But particulate matter doesn't respect your arbitrary boundaries. I have the data to prove." "The data has been reviewed and dismissed as inconclusive." Voss cut her off with finality. "This trial is not about mining regulations, but about your willful violation of preservation laws." Alara watched as uncertainty rippled through the Council, then hardened into resigned acceptance. They would not challenge Voss, not when the economic implications might threaten their delicate political alliances. "The Council has reached its verdict," Voss announced, his voice modulated to project both regret and certainty. "Dr. Alara Winters, for the crime of intentionally disrupting the protected ecosystem of Kavix 4, you are hereby sentenced to the death pit." A collective intake of breath rippled through the chamber. The death pit was no ordinary execution. It was nature's judgment. Condemned criminals were dropped into the massive sinkhole on Kavix 4's surface, where the planet's fabled apex predators were said to devour any intruder. No one had ever returned. "You cannot be serious," Alara gasped. "The death pit is a barbaric punishment from an unenlightened age. The Union abolished capital punishment centuries ago." "The death pit is not classified as execution, but as ecological integration," corrected a Mavorian representative, his metallic skin reflecting the chamber's blue light. It is the natural order reasserting itself against those who would disrupt it. Alara's mind raced through legal precedents and scientific arguments, searching for anything that might save her. The Kavix predators are sentient by every measurable standard. Feeding them prisoners violates the sentient rights accord of... The sentience of Kavix life forms remains unproven, Voss interrupted. Their behavioral patterns suggest advanced instinct, not true intelligence. Because you've never bothered to study them properly, Alara shouted, her composure finally cracking. You're using ecological preservation as an excuse for political expedience. The security drones moved closer, humming with threat. Alara took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. Losing control wouldn't help her case. High Arbiter, she said, her voice steady once more. I request the right to present new evidence regarding the sentience of Kavix predators and the true impact of the mining operations. Voss's eyes narrowed, the vertical pupils contracting to thin slits. Request denied. The evidence phase of this trial concluded yesterday. Sentence will be carried out immediately. The drones moved in, generating a containment field around Alara. She felt the familiar tingle of energy against her skin as the floor beneath her feet began to rise, forming a transport platform that would take her to the waiting prisoner ship. This isn't justice, she called out to the assembly as she was lifted away. This is fear masquerading as law. The last thing she saw before the chamber ceiling closed beneath her was the uncomfortable shifting of the assembled dignitaries. Not one of them met her eyes. The prisoner transport was little more than a reinforced capsule with a single viewport. Alara sat on the hard bench, watching as the gleaming spires of the Union Capitol gave way to the darkness of space. Her restraints allowed limited movement, enough to prevent muscle atrophy during the journey, but not enough to access any of the ship's systems. Aurora, she whispered, activating the ship's basic AI assistant. How long until we reach Kavix 4? Approximately 14 hours. Prisoner, the neutral voice responded. Would you like me to induce sleep for the duration? No, Alara needed to think, to plan. Tell me about the Death Pit. The Death Pit is a natural formation on Kavix 4, approximately 8 kilometers in diameter and of undetermined depth. It serves as the entrance to an extensive cave system that houses the planet's apex predator species, colloquially known as leviathans. Has anyone ever survived being sentenced to the pit? A pause. No official records indicate survival. Alara noted the careful wording. What about unofficial records? Another pause. Longer this time. I am not authorized to access speculative information. Interesting. The AI was programmed to avoid outright lies. Have any scientific expeditions studied the pit directly? 17 approved observation missions have been conducted from the rim of the Death Pit. No expeditions have been authorized to enter the pit itself. So no one actually knows what's down there, Alara muttered. They're sentencing people based on legends and surface observations. The AI remained silent, neither confirming nor denying her assessment. Alara turned back to the viewport, watching as the stars streaked by. If she was going to die, at least it would be in the pursuit of knowledge. And if by some miracle she survived, she would make sure the Union faced the truth about what they had been doing, both to Kavix 4 and to those they had condemned. If I do survive, she whispered to herself, I'll prove the value of ecological research. I'll make them see. The journey passed in alternating periods of restless sleep and intense planning. Alara mentally reviewed everything she knew about Kavix 4, its atmosphere, gravity, and the limited data available on its ecosystem. The planet was primarily covered in dense, fungi-like forests that produced bioluminescent spores, giving the surface an eerie, glowing quality. The Death Pit was located in the northern hemisphere, in a region where the fungal growth was particularly concentrated. When the ship finally entered the planet's atmosphere, Alara pressed her face to the viewport. Through the swirling toxic clouds, she caught glimpses of the surface, vast stretches of pulsing, blue-green organic matter, interrupted by jagged rock formations. And then she saw it. A massive dark circle that seemed to absorb all light, like a pupil in the planet's glowing iris. The death pit. The ship descended rapidly, giving her a closer view of the pit's rim. It was lined with massive, tooth-like rock formations that curved slightly inward, as if the planet itself was a giant maw ready to swallow her whole. "Preparing for prisoner release," announced Aurora. "Please move to the center of the chamber." Alara stood, her legs shaky after the long confinement. "Aurora, can you tell me anything else that might help me survive down there? Anything at all?" The AI was silent for so long that Alara thought it might be ignoring her. Then, just as the floor beneath her feet began to reconfigure into a drop platform, it spoke. "The Leviathans respond to biochemical signals. Historical data suggests they are more likely to attack those who exhibit fear pheromones." Alara's eyes widened at this unexpected help. "Thank you," she whispered. "Prisoner release in 3, 2, 1. The floor opened beneath her, and Alara plummeted into darkness. The fall seemed to last forever. Wind rushed past her ears as she tumbled through the air, the light from the surface dwindling to a pinpoint above her. Her initial scream of terror gave way to a sort of calm acceptance as the seconds stretched on. If she was going to die on impact, there was nothing she could do about it now. But curiosity soon replaced resignation. How deep was this pit? And why wasn't she accelerating as quickly as she should be? The gravity felt strange, almost as if something was gently slowing her descent. Just as this thought formed, she noticed a faint blue glow emerging from below. The light grew stronger as she fell, revealing vast networks of glowing fungi clinging to the pit walls. The organisms pulsed with an internal light that cast strange, shifting shadows across the rock face. Alara's scientific mind kicked into overdrive, observing and cataloging. These weren't just any fungi. They were a complex, interconnected network. The way they pulsed in sequence suggested some form of communication, perhaps even intelligence. As she neared what must be the bottom, she noticed something else. The air was becoming thicker, more resistant. It cushioned her fall, slowing her to a gentle drift. This couldn't be natural. The planet's atmosphere shouldn't behave this way. Unless the fungi were somehow manipulating the air currents. She landed with surprising softness on a massive, pillow-like fungal growth that glowed with a gentle azure light. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but nothing seemed broken. Alara lay still for a moment, catching her breath and allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim, pulsing light. The bottom of the death pit was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of a barren rock floor, she found herself in what appeared to be a vast underground forest of bioluminescent fungi. Towering mushroom-like structures rose hundreds of meters toward the distant opening above. Smaller varieties carpeted the ground, creating a soft, slightly springy surface that seemed to respond to her weight. Alara carefully got to her feet, taking stock of her situation. Her prison jumpsuit provided minimal protection against the cool, damp air, but at least the environment seemed breathable. The Union hadn't bothered to provide any survival gear. Why waste resources on someone meant to be eaten? A movement caught her eye, something small darting between the fungal stalks. Alara froze, remembering Aurora's warning about fear pheromones. She forced herself to breathe slowly, calming her racing heart. "I'm a scientist," she whispered to herself. "This is just a new field site." The small creature emerged again, moving cautiously toward her. It was about the size of a Terran cat, with 6 limbs and a body covered in fine, iridescent blue fur. Its head was disproportionately large, dominated by compound eyes that reflected the fungi's glow in faceted patterns. It had no visible mouth, just a series of feathery appendages where one might expect it. Alara remained perfectly still as the creature approached, its movements curious rather than threatening. When it was about a meter away, it stopped and raised its front limbs in what seemed like a greeting, or perhaps a defensive posture. Slowly, Alara mirrored the gesture, raising her hands palm forward. The creature tilted its head, then took another step closer. "Hello there," she said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The creature's feathery appendages vibrated, and a small cloud of spores drifted from them. Alara held her breath, unsure if they might be toxic, but the spores merely floated around her before settling on the ground. Taking a risk, Alara reached into the hidden pocket she had managed to maintain in her jumpsuit. The guards had confiscated most of her possessions, but they had missed the small sample case containing dried specimens from her research. She extracted a small piece of the fruit she had been attempting to introduce to Kavix 4's moon, a sweet, nutrient-dense variety she had engineered specifically to stabilize soil chemistry. She held out the morsel in her open palm. "Peace offering?" The blue creature approached cautiously, its compound eyes fixed on the dried fruit. It extended one delicate limb and touched the offering, then quickly retreated. After a moment's consideration, it returned and picked up the fruit, bringing it to its feathery appendages. The appendages parted, revealing a small orifice that pulsed with the same bioluminescent rhythm as the surrounding fungi. The creature consumed the fruit, then approached Alara again. To her surprise, it extended its limb toward her hand. When she didn't pull away, it brushed against her palm in a motion that reminded her of a cat's affectionate headbutt. Then, even more surprisingly, it pressed its feathery appendages against her skin in what could only be described as a kiss. Alara laughed softly, delighted by this unexpected interaction. "Well, aren't you friendly? I think I'll call you Sprig." Sprig, as she now thought of the creature, bobbed its large head and emitted a series of soft clicking sounds. Then it turned and scampered a few meters away, before looking back at her expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Alara asked. Sprig repeated the head-bobbing motion and continued to move away, pausing occasionally to ensure she was following. Alara hesitated. Following a strange alien creature into the depths of the death pit seemed risky. But then again, what choice did she have? Stay here and wait for the legendary Leviathans to find her? At least Sprig seemed friendly. "Lead on, little one," she said, taking a step forward. Sprig led her through the fungal forest, following what appeared to be a well-worn path among the massive stalks. As they traveled deeper, the bioluminescence grew stronger, casting enough light to see clearly. The path gradually sloped downward, leading away from the shaft of the death pit, and into a network of tunnels lined with the glowing fungi. The tunnels opened into a vast underground cavern that took Alara's breath away. The ceiling soared hundreds of meters above, completely covered in bioluminescent growth that mimicked a starry sky. The floor was a landscape of fungal formations that resembled Earth's coral reefs, complex, colorful structures that pulsed with life and light. And in the center of this subterranean wonder stood the most massive organism Alara had ever seen. The Leviathan of Kavix 4 was nothing like the mindless predator of Union legends. It resembled a colossal version of Sprig, but with significant differences. Its body was covered not in fur, but in iridescent scales that shifted color with each movement. Its head was pentagonal, with 5 compound eyes positioned around the perimeter, giving it a 360-degree field of vision. Where Sprig had feathery appendages, the Leviathan had a complex array of tendrils that waved gently in the still air. Alara froze, her heart hammering in her chest despite her efforts to remain calm. The creature was easily the size of a small spacecraft, large enough to swallow her whole without effort. Sprig scampered ahead, approaching the Leviathan without fear. The small creature emitted a series of clicks and whistles. And to Alara's astonishment, the massive Leviathan responded with similar sounds, though much deeper in pitch. Were they communicating about her? The Leviathan turned all 5 of its eyes toward Alara, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, it began to move toward her. Alara's instincts screamed at her to run, but she remembered Aurora's warning. Fear would only trigger a predatory response. Instead, she forced herself to stand her ground, consciously slowing her breathing and relaxing her posture. "I am Dr. Alara Winters," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I come in peace." The Leviathan stopped a few meters away, its massive head lowering to her level. Up close, she could see that its eyes were not simple compound structures like Sprigg's, but complex organs with visible intelligence behind them. The creature studied her for what felt like an eternity, then extended one massive tendril toward her. Alara swallowed hard, but held out her hand as she had done with Sprigg. The tendril was as thick as her arm and could easily crush her, but something told her that wasn't the Leviathan's intention. The tendril gently wrapped around her extended hand, not constraining but connecting. A warm, tingling sensation spread up her arm, not unpleasant, but strange. It felt almost like information being exchanged. Then the tendril unwrapped, and the Leviathan lowered its head further, bringing its feathery mouth appendages close to her hand. Alara held perfectly still as the massive creature delicately pressed these appendages against her palm in the same kissing motion Sprigg had performed. The significance hit her like a thunderbolt. This wasn't a predatory action. It was a greeting, a sign of acceptance. The Leviathan straightened up again and emitted a series of low, resonant tones that Alara felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. All around the cavern, other creatures began to emerge from hiding places in the fungal structures, more of Sprigg's kind, but also other species she had never seen before. They approached cautiously, but without aggression, forming a circle around her and the Leviathan. In that moment, Alara understood the truth that the Galactic Union had either never discovered or deliberately ignored. The ecosystem of Cavix 4 didn't want to destroy humans. It welcomed them, if they came with respect, rather than fear or aggression. The entire ecological network of the Death Pit was not a death trap, but a complex, interconnected community that had evolved to recognize and integrate compatible life forms. The fungi, the creatures, even the air itself, all parts of a single, vast organism that communicated through biochemical signals and collective consciousness. And somehow, impossibly, they had accepted her as part of that community. Tears welled in Alara's eyes as the implications washed over her. She had been right all along. There was sentience here, not just instinct. The Cavix ecosystem was intelligent, perhaps more so than many of the Union species that had condemned her to die here. "Thank you," she whispered, overwhelmed by the moment. The Leviathan produced another resonant tone, and Sprigg scampered up to her, tugging at her jumpsuit with gentle insistence. The message was clear. There was more to see, more to learn. Alara wiped her eyes and nodded. "Lead on, my friends. I'm ready." Over the next several days, or what felt like days, as time was difficult to track in the eternal bioluminescent glow, Alara was introduced to the wonders of the underground world. Sprigg remained her constant companion, guiding her through vast networks of caverns and tunnels that honeycombed the planet's crust. She discovered that the Death Pit was merely the entrance to an entire subterranean biosphere, one that had evolved in isolation from the surface for millions of years. The toxic atmosphere above had forced life to retreat underground, where it had developed in extraordinary ways. The fungi weren't just light sources, but the backbone of the entire ecosystem. They processed the planet's geothermal energy, purified the air, and even facilitated communication between different species through spore networks that functioned like a biological internet. Alara's scientific training allowed her to recognize patterns and processes that might have appeared magical to less educated observers. The way the air density changed to cushion her fall, the bioluminescent responses to her presence, the coordinated behaviors of different species, all could be explained by a highly evolved biochemical communication system. She began to document everything she observed, using scraps torn from her jumpsuit and pigments extracted from certain fungi to create crude but accurate notes and diagrams. Without proper equipment, she had to rely on her trained eye and memory. But the wealth of knowledge she was accumulating was worth the effort. On what she estimated to be her 5th day in the death pit, Alara made a breakthrough in communication. By observing how Sprig and other creatures interacted with the fungal networks, she began to understand the basic principles of their biochemical language. Certain gestures, combined with proximity to specific fungal species, produced consistent responses throughout the ecosystem. With careful experimentation, she learned to mimic some of these signals. She couldn't produce the spores or pheromones that the native species used, but she discovered that the fungi would respond to pressure patterns and even to the carbon dioxide in her breath if applied in specific ways. Her first successful communication was simple, a request for food that resulted in several creatures bringing her edible fungi varieties. The second was more complex, a question about water sources that led her to an underground spring with clean, mineral-rich water. By the end of her first week, Alara had established a rudimentary dialogue with the ecosystem. It wasn't language in the human sense, but it was definitely communication, ideas and needs exchanged across species boundaries. The Leviathan, which she now recognized as the central node in the communication network, seemed particularly interested in her attempts to communicate. It would observe her experiments for hours, occasionally offering corrections through Sprig or directly by guiding her hands with its tendrils. During one of these sessions, Sprig suddenly became agitated, tugging at Alara's sleeve and pointing toward a tunnel they hadn't yet explored. The Leviathan, too, turned its attention in that direction, emitting a low hum that set the fungi glowing more brightly. "You want to show me something?" Alara asked, already moving toward the tunnel. The passage was narrower than most, requiring her to duck and squeeze through in places. It descended steeply, leading deeper into the planet's crust. The air grew warmer, and the bioluminescence took on a reddish tinge that reminded Alara of warning signals. The tunnel eventually opened into a small chamber, unlike any she had seen before. The walls were not organic, but carved stone, covered in intricate patterns that were clearly artificial. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal made of the same stone, and on it rested a metallic object that seemed completely out of place in this biological realm. Sprig hung back at the entrance, unwilling to enter the chamber. Even the fungi seemed reluctant to grow here, leaving the space dimly lit by spillover light from the tunnel. Alara approached the pedestal cautiously. The object was roughly cylindrical, about the size of her forearm, with a surface etched in patterns similar to those on the walls. It was made of a metal she didn't recognize, with a dull luster that somehow absorbed the bioluminescent light rather than reflecting it. "What is this place?" she asked, knowing Sprig couldn't answer in words but hoping for some sign. The small creature made a series of clicking sounds that conveyed distress, then pointed repeatedly at the cylinder, and then up toward the surface. "Is this from above? From outside Cavix?" Alara guessed. Sprig bobbed its head in the now familiar gesture of agreement. Alara examined the chamber more closely. The carvings on the walls, when viewed as a whole, formed images, stylized depictions of creatures that resembled both the Cavix species and something else. Bipedal figures that weren't quite human, but definitely humanoid. "There was a civilization here," she breathed, the realization dawning. Not just an ecosystem, but a society. She turned back to the cylinder, running her fingers over its surface. The patterns weren't random but organized, repeating in what could only be a language. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a record of some kind. They were communicating with someone from outside, she continued, piecing together the story from the wall carvings. Trading? Collaborating? Sprigg clicked in what sounded like agreement and tugged at her jumpsuit again, eager to leave. Alara took one last look around the chamber. This changes everything. The Union needs to know about this. But how could she communicate such a discovery? She was presumed dead, dropped into the death pit as punishment for her supposed crimes. Even if she could somehow climb back to the surface, which seemed impossible given the sheer walls of the pit, she would likely be recaptured and executed properly this time. As they made their way back to the main cavern, Alara's mind raced with possibilities. The revelation of an ancient civilization that had interacted peacefully with off-worlders could change the Union's entire approach to Cavix 4. But only if she could get the information out. The Leviathan was waiting for them, its massive form illuminated by the brightest bioluminescence yet. As Alara approached, it extended a tendril toward her, wrapping it gently around her shoulders in what felt like a comforting gesture. "I need to communicate with the surface," she said, knowing it couldn't understand her words, but hoping to convey her intent through emotion and body language. "I need to tell them what's really here." The Leviathan's compound eyes studied her, and then it made a decision. It unwrapped its tendril and moved toward one of the cavern walls, pressing its appendages against a particular cluster of fungi. The organisms responded immediately, pulsing with increased brightness that spread in a wave across the ceiling. Sprigg tugged at Alara's hand, urging her to follow, as the Leviathan moved purposefully through a series of tunnels she hadn't yet explored. They ascended steadily, the passages growing narrower until they reached a small chamber near what must be the surface. She could feel slightly cooler air flowing from tiny fissures in the rock ceiling. In the center of this chamber sat something that made Alara gasp. The remains of a Union research drone, partially disassembled, but recognizable from its distinctive hexagonal sensor array. It must have been sent down to observe the death pit, and crashed, or been disabled somehow. "This is perfect," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the device. While the drone itself was beyond repair, its emergency beacon and communication module appeared intact. With some creative rewiring, she might be able to send a message back to the Union capital. Alara spent the next several hours working on the device, using her limited tools, mostly sharp pieces of stone and flexible fungal fibers, to reconnect the power source to the communication module. The work was delicate and frustrating, but her scientific training included basic engineering principles that proved invaluable. Finally, after numerous failed attempts, the communication light flickered to life. The power was minimal, perhaps enough for a single, brief transmission before the jury-rigged system failed. "One chance," she murmured, thinking carefully about what message would have the greatest impact. In the end, she recorded a simple video message, using the drone's small front camera to capture her face and the bioluminescent environment behind her. "This is Dr. Alara Winters, transmitting from the death pit of Cavix 4, she began, her voice steady despite her excitement. "I am alive and unharmed. The ecosystem here is not predatory but sentient and communicative. I have discovered evidence of an ancient civilization that once cooperated with off-world species." She held up some of her crude diagrams, showing the communication methods she had discovered and sketches of the artifact chamber. "The Union's understanding of Cavix 4 is fundamentally flawed. The lifeforms here don't want to destroy us. They want to communicate with us. I request an immediate stay of my sentence and a formal scientific expedition to document these findings." She paused, then added with more passion, "And I demand an investigation into the mining operations that are causing real damage to this unique and valuable ecosystem." The truth must be acknowledged, no matter how politically inconvenient, with a silent prayer to whatever forces might be listening. Alara pressed the transmit button. The device hummed, draining its remaining power to send her message hurtling through space toward the Union capital. Then it went dark, the last of its energy spent. "Now we wait," she told Sprigg, who had watched the entire process with evident curiosity. The wait was shorter than she had anticipated. 3 days later, as Alara was continuing her studies of the fungal communication network, a sudden disturbance rippled through the ecosystem. The bioluminescence flared in patterns she recognized as alarm, and Sprigg came bounding toward her with urgent clicks and whistles. "What is it?" she asked, rising to her feet. The small creature led her back to the Leviathan, who was focused intently on the distant ceiling of the main cavern, the direction of the death pit's opening. Alara followed its gaze and saw what had caused the alarm: lights, artificial and harsh, probing down from above. Someone had come. Her first instinct was fear. Had the Union sent forces to properly execute her? But as the lights descended further, she recognized the distinctive shape of a scientific research vessel, not a military craft. Its anti-gravity drives engaged as it carefully maneuvered down the massive shaft, respectfully, slow, and cautious. The Leviathan emitted a low, questioning hum, turning one eye toward Alara. "It's okay," she assured the massive creature, placing a hand on its scaled side. "I think they're here to listen, not to harm." The research vessel settled gently on the cavern floor, its lights dimming to avoid overwhelming the natural bioluminescence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a hatch opened, and a familiar figure emerged. High Arbiter Voss ducked his tall frame through the doorway, his crest flat against his head in what Alara recognized as a posture of submission or respect. Behind him came representatives from several Union species, all moving with deliberate care. Alara stepped forward, Sprigg at her side, and the Leviathan looming protectively behind her. "Welcome to the true Cavix 4, she called, unable to keep a note of triumph from her voice. Voss approached slowly, his eyes fixed not on Alara, but on the Leviathan. "Your message caused quite an uproar, Dr. Winters," he said, his voice subdued. "The Council has been in emergency session ever since it arrived." "And what did they decide?" Alara asked, crossing her arms. "They decided that we needed to see for ourselves." Voss finally looked at her. "Your sentence has been suspended pending a full investigation. My presence here is an acknowledgement that errors may have been made." It was as close to an apology as she was likely to get from the proud Crestian. "And the mining operations?" she pressed. "Also suspended, pending review." Voss's crest rippled with what might have been discomfort. "There have been revelations about certain council members' financial interests in those operations. Political corruption exposed. Another victory, albeit a bittersweet one." "I'm prepared to return with you to present my findings formally," Alara said. "But first, there's something you need to see." Over the next several hours, Alara guided the Union representatives through the underground world she had come to know, showing them the communication methods she had discovered and the evidence of ancient civilization. The scientists in the group were particularly fascinated by the fungal network, already taking samples and readings with proper equipment. Voss remained silent throughout most of the tour, but his crest gradually shifted from flat submission to a thoughtful blue-green that Alara had never seen before. "The Union has much to reconsider," he finally said as they stood before the artifact chamber. "Our approach to ecosystem preservation has been simplistic." "Preservation isn't enough," Alara agreed. "We need cooperation and understanding. The Cavix ecosystem isn't a museum piece to be isolated, but a partner to be engaged with." "Not all will accept this view easily," Voss warned. "There are powerful interests invested in the current paradigm. Then, they'll have to be persuaded." Alara's tone made it clear she was prepared for that fight. With science and truth. As they prepared to return to the surface, Alara faced a difficult farewell. Sprigg clung to her leg, clearly distressed at the prospect of her departure. The Leviathan, too, seemed agitated, its bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly. "I have to go," she told them, kneeling to stroke Sprigg's blue fur. "But I promise I'll come back, and I'll make sure others come too. Scientists who will listen and learn, not exploit." The Leviathan extended a tendril, wrapping it gently around her wrist. The now familiar tingling sensation spread up her arm, but this time it felt different, more intense, more deliberate. Knowledge flowed into her mind. Images, sensations, concepts that had no human words but were nevertheless comprehensible. The Leviathan was sharing its understanding of the ecosystem, its perspective on the universe, a gift of immeasurable value. When the tendril finally unwrapped, Alara stood with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll guard this knowledge and share it with those worthy of it." The Leviathan made one final gesture. It lowered its massive head and pressed its feathery appendages to the ground before her, a bow of respect from one sentient being to another. As the research vessel ascended toward the surface, with Alara aboard alongside the Union representatives, she watched the bioluminescent world shrink below her. The Leviathan and Sprigg remained visible until the last moment. 2 points of light among many in the living constellation of the Death Pit. "You've changed everything, Dr. Winters," Voss said quietly, standing beside her at the viewport. "The Union will never see Cavix 4, or any ecosystem, the same way again." "That was the point," she replied, her hand unconsciously touching the pocket where she had stored samples of the communication fungi. "Knowledge should change us. That's how we grow." The journey back to the Union capital was a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Alara spent most of the time organizing her notes and findings, preparing for the formal presentation to the full council. Voss, surprisingly, proved a valuable ally in this process, providing insight into the political dynamics she would need to navigate. By the time they arrived, news of her survival and discoveries had spread throughout the Union. The Great Hall was packed with representatives, scientists, and media from 17 species, all eager to hear the truth about the Death Pit. Alara stood before them, no longer a prisoner, but a scientist vindicated. Behind her, a massive holographic display showed images of the underground world, the bioluminescent fungi, the complex ecosystem, the artifact chamber with its evidence of ancient contact. "The Death Pit of Cavix 4 is not a place of execution, but a gateway to understanding," she began, her voice steady and clear. "What we perceived as predatory was actually communicative. What we feared was actually welcoming us, if we approached with respect rather than fear." She detailed her discoveries, explaining the fungal communication network and the evidence of previous civilization. The scientists in the audience leaned forward, captivated by the implications. Even the political representatives seemed moved by the images and data. "Most importantly," Alara continued, "I have proof that the mining operations near Cavix 4 are causing real damage to this unique ecosystem. The particulate matter is disrupting the biochemical signals that allow the fungi to communicate, effectively silencing a sentient network." This caused a stir, particularly among the representatives of species involved in the mining operations. Alara had anticipated this resistance and was prepared. "I propose a new approach, the Cavix Accord, a framework for cooperative research and sustainable interaction with the ecosystem. The mining can continue, but with proper filtration and regular monitoring by joint teams of scientists and Cavix representatives." "Cavix representatives?" questioned a Xanthian diplomat skeptically. "You suggest bringing these creatures into our political process?" I suggest acknowledging their sentience and right to participate in decisions that affect their world. Alara corrected firmly. The Leviathan has already demonstrated its willingness to communicate through me. With time and proper equipment, direct dialogue should be possible. The debate that followed was intense, with economic interests clashing against ethical and scientific considerations. But Alara had truth on her side, and, unexpectedly, the support of High Arbiter Voss, whose authority carried significant weight. "I have seen the evidence firsthand," Voss declared, his crest flaring with conviction. "The Union has operated on assumptions that have now been proven false. We must adapt our policies to reflect this new understanding." The final vote was close but ultimately in favor of the Kavix Accord. The death pit would be reclassified as a first contact zone, with all sentences of ecological integration immediately commuted. A scientific base would be established at the rim, with strict protocols for respectful interaction with the ecosystem. As the assembly dispersed, Alara found herself surrounded by scientists, eager to join the first official expedition to the underground world. Their excitement mirrored her own. The possibilities for discovery were limitless. Voss approached her as the crowd thinned, his posture formal, but his crest tinged with the blue-green of thoughtfulness. "The Council has voted to formally exonerate you of all charges, Dr. Winters," he said. "Furthermore, they wish to offer you leadership of the Kavix Research Initiative. Should you accept?" Alara smiled, thinking of Sprigg and the Leviathan waiting below. "I accept, on one condition, that our first action is to establish direct communication protocols with the Leviathan and its community. They are partners in this endeavor, not subjects of study." Voss inclined his head in agreement. "The Union is learning new ways, thanks to you. It will not be an easy path, but it is the right one." 3 months later, Alara stood at the edge of the death pit, now surrounded by a research station that hummed with activity. Scientists from a dozen species worked alongside engineers and communication specialists, all focused on the same goal: building bridges of understanding with the Kavix ecosystem. The most dramatic change, however, was the platform extending out over the pit, not for dropping prisoners but for facilitating exchange. A specially designed elevator now made regular trips between the surface and the underground world, carrying researchers and supplies down and bringing samples and data back up. Alara checked her equipment one final time before stepping onto the elevator. Today marked a significant milestone: the first test of the direct communication system they had developed, based on her observations of the fungal network. If it worked, they would be able to translate the biochemical signals of the Leviathan into something approximating language. As the elevator descended, she felt a familiar sense of wonder at the bioluminescent display that gradually revealed itself. No matter how many times she made this journey, the beauty of the death pit, now officially renamed the Kavix Nexus, never failed to move her. The Leviathan was waiting at the bottom, its massive form now a welcome sight rather than a source of fear. Beside it stood Sprigg, who immediately bounded forward to greet Alara with the familiar headbutt against her palm. "Hello, old friends," she said, kneeling to return Sprigg's greeting. "We have something new to show you today." The communication device was relatively simple in appearance, a sphere covered in biosensors that could detect and analyze the full spectrum of fungal spores and pheromones used in the Kavix communication network. Its interior contained complex translation algorithms developed from Alara's research and the knowledge the Leviathan had shared with her. She placed the device on a pedestal between herself and the Leviathan, activating it with a gesture. "This is our voice to you," she explained, though she knew the creature couldn't understand her words yet. "And yours to us." The Leviathan studied the device, then extended a tendril toward it. As the appendage made contact, the sphere began to glow, cycling through colors as it processed the biochemical signals being transmitted. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, A synthesized voice emerged from the device. Alara friend, return joy. New speak tool. Good. The words were simple, the grammar rudimentary. But the meaning was clear. First contact had truly been established. Alara's eyes filled with tears as she responded. Letting the device translate her words into biochemical signals, the Leviathan could understand. Yes, friend. We can speak now. We have much to learn from each other. The translation came through as a series of spore releases and light patterns that made the Leviathan's compound eyes flash with what she had come to recognize as pleasure. Learn together, grow together, old way return. Old way return. A reference to the ancient civilization that had once communicated with the Kavix ecosystem, now being rekindled after countless generations. As the conversation continued, growing more complex as the translation algorithms adapted, Alara couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here, from condemned prisoner to bridge between worlds, a transformation as profound as the death pit's own evolution from place of execution to nexus of understanding. The Union was changing too, slowly but surely. The Kavix Accord had inspired similar reassessments of other ecological protection zones, with scientists now looking for evidence of sentience and communication, rather than assuming its absence. There would be challenges ahead. Of course, economic interests still pushed against restrictions, and old prejudices died hard. But each time the elevator descended into the Kavix nexus, carrying new researchers eager to learn, Alara saw the future brightening. A future where respect replaced fear, where communication bridged differences, and where even the most alien of environments could become a place of connection rather than conflict. As night fell on Kavix 4, the research station's lights dimmed to better appreciate the natural bioluminescence that now rose from the pit in celebratory patterns. The Leviathan was singing. There was no better word for the coordinated light and spore display that conveyed emotions beyond simple translation. Standing at the edge, watching this alien yet familiar expression of joy, Alara felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what her science had always been about, not just understanding the universe but connecting with it. From death pit to life nexus, she murmured, as the bioluminescent display reached its crescendo. That's a research outcome worth falling for. And somewhere far below, in the glowing heart of Kavix 4, a small blue creature named Sprig pressed its feathery appendages to the ground in the gesture of respect it had learned from its massive friend. A salute to the human who had transformed their world by simply being willing to understand rather than fear. The connection, once made, would never be broken again.